Hello, I'm Cascade, and I've played over 300 board games, so I'm going to talk about those. We're going to be going in order from lowest to highest by Board Game Geek Ranking, so this is not in order of my preference, this is in order of the world's preference. I'm going to be using my own rating system from 1 to 10. Obviously, you can rate games on Board Game Geek from 1 to 10, but they have their own description of what all those numbers mean. I think that system is kind of silly. So I'm using my own system. Games that are 1 or a 2 are essentially unplayable or shouldn't have been published. Ones have no redeeming quality at all, whereas 2 might have some interesting ideas, but essentially should have remained on the design table or needed some serious rework if they even deserve that. Games 3 to 5 are games that I think have some serious issues and that I really don't want to play. 3 games are pretty bad, but a lot of 3 games get a 3 because they have some kind of historical significance, like they actually deserve a place in our culture. Often they're games for kids, or they have some ideas that carry on into more complicated games. A 4 would be a game that I think has more bad points than good points, and a 5 is essentially an average game that I don't want to play, that I understand some people will probably really like, but that's kind of the threshold for me. 5 and below, I don't want to play it ever. 6 is we're going in 6 and 7. That's games that I can either be convinced to play or will play if you like playing them. A 6 is a game that I think has some issues, but I'll still enjoy it on the odd occasion. Some games will be only barely a 6. It's like, yes, I will play that, like maybe once a year if you happen to have it and really like it or whatever. 7, there's going to be a lot of games in the 7 category. It's a game that I'll play at a board game club or a friend's house because they really like it, and I'll enjoy it on the odd occasion when I play it with them, but I'm never going to be the one to suggest we play it. And then 8, 9s and 10s are basically games that I want to play based on how much I enjoy the game and how often I want to play it. And I'm going to be very opinionated, and it is the way it is, and some of what I say might sound like I'm being kind of categorical and objective and scientific about it, but at the end of the day, it's just my personal opinion of games that I've played. For the purpose of this list, I'm not including, when I count the 300, I'm only counting one version of a game, not, like, for example, Carcassonne or Ticket to Ride. There's a whole heap of different versions of those. I'm basically picking one, giving it a rating when we get there. I'll talk about the different versions, unless there is a particular variation of the game that I think deserves special attention. I've played a lot more than 300 board games, but a lot of them are variations of other games or reworks or new editions or whatever. I'm only talking about the base game here, no expansions. As I've said, it's my opinion, and I'm not including Crokinole on this list because I don't think it belongs on Board Game Geek. Tic Tac Toe. It's not a very exciting game. It's something you play on pencil and paper when you're a kid, or you might play these things in the playground like this. It does form a foundation for things like Connect 4, other like Pentago type games, Pente, even Go, things like that, moving, blocking, whatever. So it gets a 3. Chutes and Ladders, or as it was when I grew up, Snakes and Ladders. Again, this is a 3 from me. It is, it's sort of a rite of passage as children. It is slightly better than, say, Candyland, which I've never played, because at least in this one you've got to be able to count. Also, we'll just put a shout out that even though in Australia and Britain it's Snakes and Ladders, in America it's Chutes and Ladders, I guess snakes are just too scary for American children or something. I will say that chutes actually kind of make more sense than snakes. You do slide down chutes and climb up ladders. That actually kind of makes sense. I like this one. It's got these, sins and virtues or whatever, and so it's a little bit of moral teaching in whether you go up or down. I think that's kind of interesting. Monopoly. I'm actually sticking my neck out a bit here and giving this a 5. Monopoly for me has been a game that has come up at various times in my life. Now, I would not play it now. It is problematic for all sorts of reasons. It's roll and move. You're basically going where you're going. The first person to collect sets of cards is going to have a huge advantage. It goes on way too long. There's player elimination, and then the game still then goes on way too long. Anyway, it doesn't need to be a diatribe about the problems with Monopoly, but I have had Monopoly in and out of my life for a very long time, and it was probably the first ever really in-depth kind of game, a game that wasn't just about moving a piece around a board or something. I remember being about 8 or 9 years old and actually sitting down and reading the rules of Monopoly, because I think very few people have actually done that. And I discovered the auction rule, and I remember saying, we're going to have to play Monopoly. This was, no one in my family played Monopoly, but you'd sometimes be at a kid's house or whatever, and they would have it, and I would beg to play it, And so there's this rule about auctions. If you don't buy it, you've got to auction it off, and it revolutionised the game. Took some convincing to get people to actually do it. But I tell you what, Monopoly without the auction rule is pretty dry. At least that forces properties to get bought. If you're going round and round and round and round the board, and every time someone decides not to buy it, then it just sits there, that extends the game, as does the stupid free parking rule that people do. When I was in my late teens, early 20s, I had a friend who was hardcore into Monopoly, and he was the one who taught us about immunities and things like that. Like, oh yeah, well, I'll give you this property, you give me that, and then the next 2 times you land on that property, you don't have to pay rent. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, well that changes the thing, because that's going to give you a set. And then it's like, do I want an immunity on the whole set or just that one? What's he prepared to give me? He's going to get an advantage against the other players, which weakens them against me. But then eventually he's going to build that up, and then I'm going to have to pay rent, right? So there are ways to be interesting about Monopoly. When I was in my mid to late 20s, we had a PlayStation 1 version of Monopoly. The AI was really, really dumb, but me and my wife at the time would, to be able to play Monopoly with a third player, even the dumb AI player, was obviously Monopoly does not play with 2. Do not ever play Monopoly with 2. It's 3 or 4. That's it. Apparently some versions do up to 8. I always knew it came with all those tokens in the box. I always just assumed that was to give you an option of which one you wanted to play. I never assumed that anyone would actually play it with 8 players. But according to this, you can. But yeah, we played with this. And that version allowed you to include a single immunity in the trade. If you're trading with the AI, you could say, I want this property, you have a little box, this is what I'm giving you, this is what you're giving me, also an immunity. It's the only electronic version I know of that did that. Now, the AI was really stupid in other ways, like it would sell you a property it just bought for like $1 or something. So obviously whoever wrote the AI didn't really care, but whoever designed the UI at least wanted to include that as a thing. I had a really nasty Windows 3.1 version where you could actually go in, and there was an ini file, if anyone remembers those, and you could actually adjust the parameters of the AI as to which properties it liked more than others and what its valuation thing was for things based on what you had, and you could actually tweak all that. I think I had more fun doing that than actually playing the game, but that was a multimedia Monopoly where as your piece moved around the board it would show these little video animations out of sync with the audio, and that was a heap of fun. And then somewhere along the line I had an iPhone version too that I played a few times. I would not play it today, but it historically has been a part of my life, and I think you play with the quick start rules, which is officially included now. A lot of the electronic versions used to have that, where you deal out 2 properties each, you got to buy them, but it starts the game with some properties seated on the board, and then I would stop playing the game. Well, I wouldn't play it anyway now, but if you stop playing the game when the first player is eliminated, that stops the whole grind to the end. And I think very few people actually play Monopoly all the way to the end anyway. So the official, unofficial rule of Monopoly is nobody plays to the last player. Like, somebody gets fed up and walks away long before that. I remember king-making a friend of mine. I landed on his property, and I could afford to liquidate nearly everything. It had come down to 3 of us. I could afford to liquidate everything and pay his rent, and I still would have had a few properties left over, and there was a chance I could have come back. But the guy who taught us about the trading immunities, he was the clear winner and was going to win, and was being a bit obnoxious about it, because he often was anyway. And so when I landed on this guy who was my flatmate at the time, his property, I'm just like, you know what? Here. And I just picked up everything of mine and gave it to him, and king made him that he would beat the other guy. Anyway, that's Monopoly, a game with serious problems. Also, if you don't know, have a look into the Landlord's game, which is basically the game that Monopoly was ripped off of. There's a whole history here. It does have its own entry on Board Game Geek, but go YouTube, Landlord game, watch some videos if you don't know about the history of the game that came out before Monopoly. It wasn't meant to be fair. It wasn't meant to be a strategic, challenging game. It was meant to be a game that taught the evils of capitalism. So it's basically a socialist propaganda piece as a game, and then it was turned into this other thing, this beacon of capitalism, really, because it became the game that people talk about. That's the worst thing about Monopoly, is that when people say, "Oh, you play board games like Monopoly," and you think, it's like telling a foodie that they like restaurants like McDonald's. The game of life, I can't believe this rate's higher than Monopoly, honestly, but it does. I'll give this a 3. It is a roll and move game. This is the version that I had as a kid. I don't remember it being so red and orange, but the buildings, the stickers, everything else, these curves have been kind of smoothed out a bit, I think, in the new version. I'm thinking that I would maybe need a little bit more alcohol than this to play this game now. You move around the board and different lifestyle things happen when you land on different places. We had this as a kid. When I was a kid, remember playing it 2 or 3 times. There were these cards, these event card things, and we never figured out the rules for those, so we never used them. I don't know when you were supposed to draw one or what. And of course, you get these. You start with a mummy or a daddy, depending on which one you are, and you marry at some point, and then you have children. And I remember one time playing with my sister, and she had more children than would fit in one car. So we had to use one of the spare cars, and every time she moved, she had like 8 or 9 children. There's probably some rule that says if you fill up your car that you don't keep going, but she just kept landing on all the family growth spaces or whatever it's called. It's got this dumb rule at the end where you can bet all your money that you've accumulated in one spot and roll it, and you become an instant millionaire or something. Like, who cares at that point? It's a dumb roll and move game for kids. Operation. I'm giving this a 6, because if somebody rocked up with this, or if I was on someone's house and I saw this on their shelf, I would want to give it a go. It's not a 7. A 7's a game that I would kind of hope that maybe somebody wanted to play and that really liked it and occasionally would play, would be happy to play and enjoy, whereas 6 is like a game that I will play. But I don't know, so maybe it should be a 7, not a 6. But it would be literally a 7 until I had played it for 2 or 3 minutes, and then it would immediately drop to a 5. So that averages out to a 6, I think. This is the version that I had not in whatever language that is. It's got these, like, you got an Adam's apple and a funny bone and a wishbone and a broken heart and a bread box or whatever, different parts of the body with different play on words, not euphemism so much. Plays on words, and you get the tweezers, and there's metal, and it's a battery powered thing, and if you touch the sides, you get there's these cards, and you're supposed to play for money. You draw a card, and it tells you what body part to remove, and then if you do it successfully, you get money. And then there's this really wonky rule about there's surgeons and there's doctors, and if you're a surgeon, you earn twice as much of a dog. We could never figure out. Nobody plays this for the rules. You play it to play a dexterity game and play around with it as a toy for 10 or 15 minutes, which I've done a few times in my life. I've never owned a copy, had friends that owned a copy. If I saw a copy of this, I would love to give it a go. Novelty would probably wear off in 5 or 10 minutes, and that would be the end of that, and I would never need to play it again for my entire life. Mousetrap. Mousetrap, I bought Mousetrap with my own money. I mean, it would have been money that a relative would have given me, but I bought this with my own money, which my mother was really not impressed with, because she told me not to spend any money without. I was like 10, barely 10, and I went out and did it anyway. It was probably my first act of proper rebellion. No, my first act of proper rebellion would have been buying Mad magazines, because she didn't like those either. But that was a couple of dollars here and there. This was my first blatant, naked act of rebellion as a child, directly going against my mother's wishes. It was December. It must have been December of '83. And my mother just never liked board games much anyway, mostly. And she just didn't want me to spend money because I had bought too many things lately or been given too many toys or whatever. And anyway, so I was punished for that. But anyway, this is a terrible game, except for the aspect of the Rube Goldberg machine that it is. If you ever find a copy of this, just build it. Like, that's the best part of it. Just build it. What you're supposed to do is roll the dice, and every time you land on a 1, you put a piece on. And if you land on a colour, you don't. And then there's stupid move ahead, shortcut, and stupid, really, really stupid roll and move stuff. And the worst part about the game is when you get to here, so you build it, and you keep going, and then as soon as everyone gets around to here, you keep going around and around and around. So somebody lands on here, then you turn the crank to set it off, and all the different things go off, and the ball rolls down here, and blah, 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 and all that happens. But you keep playing. You don't just stop playing. I don't think very many people actually, probably another game, most people don't actually know what the rules are. So you land here, and you keep moving. And if it comes back around to your turn, and you can roll and you can move out the way, you move out the way. Meanwhile, this is all going. It takes 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, I don't know how. It takes a while for all this stuff to go off. Somebody else might have moved in there and they get caught. No one's playing the game at that point. You build it, you get to the end. Oh, that was fun. You set it off the first time you set it off. Maybe you keep going for one more turn or two and you set it off again, and then you pack it all up and put it in the box. You don't. It's a game that's to be sold as a toy to kids, not a game that's to be actually played seriously for what it is. But setting this up, I remember building this in my room for something to do. We played this in a motel room. My mother, the few times in my life I actually convinced my mother to play a board game, me, my mother and my sister, my father had passed away a few years earlier, in a motel room somewhere between Armidale and Sydney, somewhere in the Hay Desert somewhere. And we played this in a motel room in the air conditioning because it was stinking hot. It was a very hot summer, and the only time I've ever been to South Australia, and we were on our way back, and we did play this game, and I don't know how far we got into it, but it would have all been built up. And then it's set up on my shelf, and probably only got paid 3 or 4 times, and there were probably 3 or 4 more times that I pulled it out and set it up. Good. It's a good fun toy if you find a copy somewhere. If you get one cheap somewhere, set it up, play around with it, give it to some 5 or 6 year old who's, a bit engineering inclined. Sorry, I'm giving this 6 out of 10. I own a copy, this particular copy, 2003 printing of the game. I know this because I went and checked, and the reason I checked is because this is basically Pachisi or Ludo, which I'm going to get to very soon. I don't know why this is rated worse than Pachisi. This is vastly superior to Pachisi. But it's the same basic idea. You start, you move around the board, you get your people home. That's okay. I'm going to jump ahead. That's Ludo. We grew up with this as Ludo. This is Pachisi, right? The difference is you play with cards, and it's card driven instead of dice driven. And there is a adult version. It's called the adult version, or the adult suggested version for adults, and it was in the old copy that my mother had. It was the only board game she used to play way back. I remember my parents playing this when I was 3 or 4 years old. We'd go around to, they had a friends and they had kids our age or whatever, and the adult, the 2 couples would play teams. And in the rules, my 2003 version has the team rules and the rule where you have a hand of 5 cards. You don't just draw a card and do it. You actually have a hand of cards. You play teams across the table, and they would swap partners for that. And so all the things about sending people home and swapping pieces around and all that kind of stuff, that there's cards that let you swap pieces around, or put your piece where their piece is and send their piece home. But when you're playing partners, you can do things that actually put both of you ahead, so there's a bit more going on. It's a really good Take That game. 6 out of 10. That's what I think of Take That games. I've never taken this to Board Game Group. I don't imagine I ever will. I keep my copy for sentimental reasons mainly, because I remember my mother and father playing it. They had, I think, was this version, was this version. Oh, and this was out of print for a long time in Australia. You just couldn't get it. This is a handmade version from Tuvalu. Wow. I actually made a version sometime around 98, 99. So that was a few years before I actually came back into print. I actually made a 2-player version, smaller board, made my own cards, printed them on the computer. This was a dot matrix printer. Got manila folders, glued paper to card, made cards that could be shuffled and played with, and made a 2-player version from my own memory with the slide. You get these slide things where if you land here, you slide to here, or you can knock other players off and stuff, to play as a 2-player version because you couldn't get it anywhere. Which we did play a few times, and then eventually I did get a proper copy, which has been played a couple of times, but I don't think I've ever played it properly with the 4 players and everything. But if you go for the advanced rules and you play in teams, this is a decent game. This is actually okay, and way better than just the roll and move that is Parcheesi. It's just that I think people remember playing it where you just draw a card and you do whatever, so there's no choices, and then there's a whole take that game. It's funny, people will play games that are quite mean and in your face. Sam Healy really hates Sorry, really hates Sorry, but he'll play Twilight Imperium for 6, 7, 8 hours or whatever, which is about as take that as you can get as far as I can tell, and much longer. But anyway, that's for later in the list. Hungry Hippos. I'm giving this an 8. For the same reason that I probably should have given Operation an 8. And that is that if I saw this, if someone brought this out, if I was at someone's house, I absolutely would want to play this now. Again, it'd probably drop to a 765 fairly quickly after that. But this is a hoot. This is great. You know, if you've never seen this, you press the lever on the thing and you gobble up as many marbles, and it's over in like less than 2 minutes. It's just super quick game. Silly little thing. There's a little bit of timing in it, like the marbles all bounce around like crazy, and if you can time it just right, you can maybe grab a marble. It's dumb, stupid fun. Parcheesi, the game with a million names. Well, actually I think it does say here how many names it's got. 32 more plus all of those. For me, growing up, this was always called Ludo, which is actually on the list, as well as a lot of other variations of some giant Ludo, golden Ludo, frozen Ludo. It is the game upon which Sorry is based. You roll a die, you move around the board. If you land on a space occupied by someone else, you send them home. And you've got 4 pieces, so there's a little bit of choice. You roll a die, and then you decide which of your pieces you're going to move. And you've got to do a lap of the board and come back and land on the home. And the getting home is the tedious bit, because you've got to roll exact numbers and it just drags the game out. And Sorry does that too. I would suggest house ruling that you don't have to get the exact numbers to get home. That would make a big improvement too. A lot of people have probably played Trouble or seen Trouble, which is basically the same thing, only with the Pop-O-Matic dice. Oh, it's so exciting. There's another game with a Pop-O-Matic dice that will come up higher on the list that is better than this. But because Trouble gets its own entry on the list, but it is literally just a plasticky version of Ludo or Parcheesi with maybe a few less spaces. And I just wanted to mention as well, because it took me a while to find this, Uckers, because I was surprised this didn't come under the same category of Parcheesi. Now, this is a game that is played in the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, the Australian Royal Navy. It's like a hero game that they'll have in the rec room sometimes, and often, betting money on it and whatever. It has this rule about you can stack pieces up and move them together and block other pieces from coming around. I don't know all that much about it, and I can't really speak to the military significance, but it's kind of this tradition, and obviously it's considered to be different enough to Parcheesi to get its own entry. I'm not going to argue. I think generally speaking, the rules on Board Game Geek about when something deserves its own entry and when it doesn't is sometimes a little bit weird. I understand why Trouble gets its own entry. Sorry gets its own entry. So officially for my list, I'm talking about Sorry and Parcheesi, but I'm just mentioning other versions, Trouble and Uckers, because that might be something people might be interested in. But Parcheesi gets a 3 insofar as it is sort of, I think, in that same category as like Tic Tac Toe or Shoots and Ladders. It has historical significance. It is the basis for other games, as I've demonstrated, and it does have that little bit of you choose which piece to move, and if you can move a piece that lands on someone else, you can send them home. There's a little bit of choice space. Maybe it could be a 3.5 or a 4. It's just not going to be interesting to play more than once or twice. It's a game for 6, 7, 8-year-olds who probably these days are playing iPads and stuff anyway. Teach basic counting and some choices, and if you move that piece, you can land on that guy, and that's what you want to do. Send him home, and then if you get sent home, then you're going to learn to not be all sad about it. Yes, you'd be disappointed, but like a basic gameplay and fairness and sportsmanship or whatever. So that will wrap up video number 1. The games will get better.